Welcome to Spooky Southcoast.
Look, I know the supernatural is something that isn't supposed to happen, but it does happen.
Good evening and welcome to Spooky Southcoast. Tim Weisberg here, flying solo for this special recorded edition of Spooky Southcoast. And we've had some sports that have kept us off the air on WBSM as well as a Legend Trips event. But we are very excited to be able to provide you this program via podcast. Because joining us is Nick Redfern. Nick works full-time as an author, lecturer, and journalist. He writes about a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, alien encounters, and government conspiracies. He writes for UFO Magazine, Fate, and 40 Times. His previous books include Keep Out, The Real Men in Black, The NASA Conspiracies, Contactees, and Memoirs of a Monster Hunter. An extremely popular media guest, Nick appears on several television documentary programs, and he's joining us here once again on Spooky Southcoast to talk about his new book, The Monster Files. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Thanks a lot.
And it seems like every time we have you on, we do these kind of podcast-only episodes. Sooner or later, we've got to get you on a Saturday night and get it going live.
Yeah, that would be cool.
So this new book now, Nick Redfern's Monster Files, it's a topic that you've covered in the past, writing about different cryptids and different strange and unusual creatures, but this is a different approach for you with this book.
Yeah, I've written about 7 or 8 books on various aspects of cryptozoology. Cryptozoology being the study of unknown animals like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the abominable snowman, the chupacabra, etc. And this one's a bit of a departure because pretty much all the other books I've written on this particular subject have been sort of done road trip style, where I've gone on expeditions and then sort of written it up in the form of like a diary type book, which is how I usually do it, road trip style. But this one's a bit different because it deals with government files on strange creatures. In other words, it's sort of like an X-Files type study, but where each of the chapters is not around UFOs or conspiracies or, anything like that. It's actually based around sightings and encounters involving weird creatures. And a lot of people, even within cryptozoology, aren't sort of aware or haven't been, of the sheer extent to which government agencies all around the world have had some sort of involvement in weird creatures over the years and the decades. So that's what sort of prompted me to write it, was the fact that, I always you want to bring something new to the table for the readers. So I thought, well, a book that looks at what government agencies know rather than what cryptozoologists know would be sort of a new slant on it.
Right, but it's hard enough to collect these stories when you're just looking for general encounters that people have had, and maybe some cryptozoologists have looked into things over the years. But when you're talking about getting into government files, and that must be even harder because now you're going up against disinformation in addition to information.
Well, it depends really, because this is sort of this isn't like a military secret or stuff I'm digging into. It's sort of more quirkier, weird files. So when I got snippets of stories and I knew there was official interest, it was literally a case of just filing freedom of information requests. And in most cases that where I applied for them, the government agencies were very helpful. They were like, here's the files. They declassified them officially and legally to me. I don't get involved in the whole issue of leaked files or anything like that, because that's inevitably going to end you up in deep, deep trouble.
Right.
The files I use in my books are ones which are surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act legally, which have been declassified. So that's what I did with this book. It's filled with various reports from around the world where agencies, I have to say, they were very good about it. They released them, and even in a couple of cases where they were redacted, there were still portions that were readable. So, I found that encouraging, but it didn't so much surprise me because, as I said, we're not dealing so much with, a regular military issue, which, is some things I don't really investigate, sort of political stuff. This was sort of on the weirder side, involvement with strange animals, which I guess 20, 30, 40 years after some of the files were compiled, it wasn't sort of perceived as being, something that had to remain classified. It was just, I guess, not many people had really tried to get the files before. So, in other words, they just sort of sat on a shelf awaiting declassification, if you like.
I'm sure a lot of these stories, are things that are bandied about in the particular offices that may have the files on them over the years. When an incoming recruit comes in, these are the stories that they start hearing about from the veterans. It's something that just was probably a lot of internal conversation over the years before you came along.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure, sort of word of mouth and sort of institutional memory, it's like, oh, these are our weird files, when you get the job or whatever. And, but again, it's sort of like a fascinating and weird bit of military and intelligence history, as to how and why this involvement and interest has gone on for so long. And probably to an extent, it probably still does go on in some quarters. I have got cases in the book officially documented like from the 1990s, etc. So it wouldn't surprise me that, if we didn't uncover other stuff in the next few more years as well.
Well, it's really interesting when you read about some of the programs that were put in place, and some of them being just rumors, things like the manimals, trying to put together a soldier that's half human, half ape, or trying to come up with these hybrid creatures that could be bred for the purposes of defense. And it just seems like the stranger that they got, the more interesting the case may be, because there seem to be a lot of examples that you give in the book that maybe these aren't just something that existed solely on paper.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fact that government agencies, around the world explore alternative ways of beating the enemy or, getting the upper hand, so to speak. And, ways to defeat the enemy, often using psychological warfare and alternative methods to having to avoid sending troops into battle and risk them getting shot. There are all sorts of different ways of combating and beating the enemy. So I think probably all this comes into play, when it comes to addressing these various issues. It's sort of what's the capital gain of investigating it, or is there any? And sometimes, a project is seen as being feasible or doable, and then over time it's shown not to be workable and it's shut down, but the files are just preserved, for posterity or whatever.
When you're putting all these stories together, I mean, did it start to click some of the things that you've heard cryptozoologically over the years, that some of these stories that just regular people have had as sightings may have ties to these government files?
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of along those lines, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's been doing a lot of crypto research for sort of 15, 20 years, I heard snippets of stories, where there was official interest. For example, British government interest in big cat sightings, sort of escaped large cats running around the UK like leopards, which the government clearly tried to play down, for fear of worrying people. And there have always been rumours of sort of an official project or almost like a word of mouth not to talk about this within government circles or to play it down. And so over the years I got snippets of stories like this where, somebody would say, hey, when I was in the military, we went on this big cat hunt on the wilds of Dartmoor, England or whatever, and we were told not to talk about the fact that we were trying to hunt these big cats down. And of course, then years later, some of these documents actually did begin to surface, showing that the government was looking for these big cats. So that's how a lot of it began, was people contacting me and then me using the bare bones to try and uncover further parts of the story. And then as I began to do that, then you're in a position more to apply for files when you can tell the relevant agency, this is what I'm looking for, this is the relevant time period. Because that's something you have to do with the Freedom of Information Act. It's no good saying, dear British government, I want your reports, please sending to me on big cats. It's not that easy. You've got to be able to try and determine which military unit was involved, what the dates were, and what the location was, and then ask if the relevant logbooks or, station logbooks and diaries for that base and that period have anything relevant, and then they go and check them and say, yes, they do, or no, they don't, and yes, you can have it, or no, you can't. You've got to be quite specific when it comes to filing requests, and so it's like a catch-22 thing. You can't get the information released until you can provide information that allows them to search for the material. But unless you've got the information, it's difficult for them to search for it. So.
Right. And it is kind of circular, too, in the way that, we hear about these cases like Bigfoot, Yetis, things like that, and then you see that there's government interest in them. But one of the cases that I thought was particularly interesting was the Flatwoods Monster, which we've all heard that story. Anybody that follows crypto stories knows about the Flatwoods Monster. But in the book, you talk about the fact that it could be a creation of America's intelligence community.
Yeah, this is a very weird story. I mean, the Flatwoods Monster was this strange creature that was seen, as you might guess from its name, in the little town of Flatwoods in West Virginia. Now, Flatwoods is still only a small town today with just several hundred people in its population. But back in 1952, there was a major wave of UFO activity over the United States, which kind of culminated in a famous series of encounters across 2 weekends in July 1952, where there were multiple UFO reports across Washington, D.C. They were tracked on airborne radar, ground radar. The FBI and the military were involved in trying to figure out what was going on. And it was in broadly this same time frame that this incident at Flatwoods occurred. And it essentially involved a sighting of this sort of giant, monstrous humanoid creature that became known as the Flatwoods Monster. And the story was that a number of people in the little town saw strange lights and in the sky and thought something had come down behind this large hill. So they trekked up there, sort of like typical sort of rural, wooded, hilly area, and didn't see anything at first, but suddenly this sort of 12-foot tall, glowing-eyed contraption loomed out of the trees, and it was described, as I said, about 12 feet tall, and it had these strange, like, electric sparks and arcs coming from it, kind of like you imagine in these old black and white Frankenstein movies, when Dr. Frankenstein pulls a lever and suddenly, the monster comes to life and there's sparks and, like, lightning and all sorts of flashing in the lab, Mm-hmm. But the monster was sort of surrounded by all these weird lights and flashes, etc. And it had this strange-shaped head. It was like the Ace of Spades image in a deck of cards. And quite naturally, when you're sort of faced with this glowing-eyed, sparking, 12-foot-tall monster, that all the people fled. And they sort of tentatively went back a few hours later, but there was no sign of it. Now, the case, for all intents and purposes, has remained unresolved to this day. Nobody really knows what it was. The case wasn't repeated, although some people have wondered if Mothman, which was also in West Virginia sort of 15 years later, could have been connected, sort of like a glowing-eyed thing coming through the trees. And what was interesting about the Flatwoods Monster is it did seem to be floating rather than actually walking, so that is an interesting angle. So I'll be the first to admit, we're not really sure what happened, and I don't think it ever will be resolved. But when I was doing research into it, I came across a declassified Freedom of Information Act document that had originated with the RAND Corporation. And this was a document prepared for the military on how paranormal phenomena could be used as a tool of psychological warfare. And to give people an example, there were references in there how stories and rumours had been created that when the Allies were going into battle against the Germans in the Second World War, and also when, the Russians were flexing their muscles in the early years of the Cold War, the rumours were spread that sightings of the Virgin Mary had been made following Allied troops, but not following the German troops. So the idea was to try and instill in the enemy that God and the Virgin Mary were on the side of the Allies. And the idea was to try and weaken the morale of the Germans and the Russians, etc. And so, you had a lot of these weird ideas played out in this document about how, as I said, paranormal stuff, supernatural phenomena, could be used to sort of frighten and, lower the, willpower and threshold of the enemy. And one of the programs that was discussed in there, as an example, was a Second World War operation that the British military initiated in Italy. And the plan was to basically go to, strangely enough, little villages in Italy, which sounded eerily like Italian equivalents of Flatwoods. So isolated little villages with just a couple of hundred people there. And the plan was to release this robotic contraption that the British Army had built. and it was described as like the Flatwoods Monster being 12 feet tall, and it had all these wires and gizmos coming off it that when the right buttons were pressed, it would flash and arc and sparks would burst from it, etc. And they specifically sort of released it, if you like, or unleashed it, in areas where there was tree cover, where it wouldn't be seen too closely, but it would be seen close enough where people get the idea that it was some sort of demonic creature. Mm-hmm. And the military, the second part of the plan was to spread rumors that it was the devil come for the villagers because the devil was on the side of, or come to punish, if you like, the villagers and take them away for helping the Germans. It's sort of like a roundabout way of spooking and scaring the Italian villagers to try and come over onto the Allied side rather than, work with the Germans, etc. And we don't really know to what extent it worked, or if it was just some weird crackpot program that got so far and then was cancelled because it was seen as too way out. But we do know from the files that this 12-foot-tall sparking monster was actually used and tested in Italian villages late at night, on unwitting and unknowing villagers. So when you look at the parallels, the location, the small village, which could easily be targeted and watched and determine what the local reaction was, the height was exactly the same, 12 feet, and the sparks and, the electric static coming off it, etc., that was exactly the same. So, I sort of asked the question in the book, because I admit we don't have the answer. I asked the question, though, is it possible this was like some sort of domestic example where the military was sort of inspired by this original British program to release one of these things and see how legends and myths developed and how belief systems could be manipulated and how people could be frightened by something that never really existed in literal terms.
Right. I mean, it could be a matter of that. It could be kind of seeing how they would respond to a boogeyman type scenario. But at the same time, I mean, what I was thinking when you put that kind of twist on it, I was thinking that it could also be something that you're talking at a time when we're at the height of the initial wave of UFO reports. So maybe this was a way to see what would happen if a creature from another planet came to this country. How would the citizens react? It could have been a similar exercise.
Yeah, well, that's actually something, I've addressed in a couple of books over the years, the idea that there was clearly, certainly today, there's a significantly less number of high-quality reports of, like, flying saucers, UFO landings, the typical stuff of aliens taking soil samples or strange pod marks on the ground. We just don't really get much in the way of those type of reports today. But back in the early 50s, we did, all over the planet. It was like some sort of stealthy sort of investigation of the planet was going on by creatures from somewhere else. But they were being very standoffish. And there are a number of cases which suggest they were maybe fabricated, not to necessarily fool people, but to try and, not to fool them into believing aliens were invading, but to try, if the aliens themselves weren't going to show themselves to us, the government may have needed or wanted to know how the public would react. And so if the aliens aren't going to show themselves and demonstrate it, what about fabricating a number of UFO incidents and watch the response of the witnesses? If the witnesses thought they were real alien encounters or invasions or whatever, that would give officialdom a good indication of how the population would react under a real scenario. And of course, these events would be carefully controlled, and no harm would be done to the witnesses. It really would just be a case of gauging their response. So, I think that's an important issue to keep in mind. The whole angle of, well, if the aliens aren't going to land, and we don't know how people are going to respond, we're going to have to put the issue.
I also wonder, too, especially when you're talking about a time in the early to mid-1950s and even into the 1960s, if it wasn't a matter of the government's trying to prepare us for any case of foreign invaders. I mean, we're worried about the Russians at this point, the Soviets, and maybe using UFOs and using alien creatures was almost like a benign avatar that they could put in place of a Soviet invasion so they could see how the people would respond if that was to happen on our soil.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to remember on that angle is, there seems to be Certain agencies were involved in more cryptid stories, others it was strictly UFO stuff. And I think we always need to remember that, when we talk about the government, it's sort of not one unified entity, It's actually multiple agencies and departments and think tanks and little funded projects, all with their own agendas, which, have sort of national security and the preservation of national security at their heart, but they're not necessarily all working hand in glove together. Maybe some of them, for need-to-know reasons, weren't even aware that the other projects existed. So I think this is an important factor as well, that, people might say, well, why on earth would one agency be using UFOs and another one creating this weird 12-foot-tall monstrous contraption? And I think the answer is because they weren't working together. That's the whole point. That's how national security thrives, is on need to know. You're only told enough to do your own job to preserve the security, etc. And so I think that sort of comes to mind, the idea that there are, you can well imagine Air Force high-ranking people sitting in one office saying, let's think about doing this, and then Army personnel in another on the other side of the country thinking, why don't we try that? I think that probably comes into play a lot as well.
Well, and they do really seem to be looking for tactical advantages too in a lot of these stories. When something happens from the civilian end, it's almost like these agencies descend upon it to try to find a way that they can maybe weaponize it or maybe utilize it to their own for their own ends. And one of those stories that comes to mind is the Minnesota Iceman, because the FBI was kind of all over that story.
Yeah, the Minnesota Iceman, I should say, is a very weird story, which surfaced in the mid-1960s by a man named Frank Hansen. And he was somebody who basically would put on displays at like state fairs and carnivals, that kind of thing. And he wasn't, as some people said, owner of like a circus freak show, of the olden days. But it was more, look at the two-headed cow, that kind of thing, And a lot of them were models, etc. But the one that really stood out was the so-called Minnesota Iceman. And this was described as being a very ape-like but also primitive humanoid-type hair-covered bipedal creature. And there are a number of rumors concerning its origins. One was that it was shot and killed in Minnesota, hence the name. Another one was that it was also shot and killed but in Vietnam during the course of the Vietnam War. And the story is that the body was supposedly shipped back to the United States by U.S. soldiers in a body bag and sold to an unknown millionaire. That's the official story, at least, or one of the official stories. And even to this day, we don't really know which story, if any of them, were actually true. What we do know is that Frank Hansen vehemently claimed that, for a number of years, the real Minnesota Iceman, whatever it was, like a primitive human, something similar to Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon man, or a primitive but highly intelligent ape of some sort that science hadn't identified. We don't know. But Hansen claimed that it was the real thing on show for a while, but then this rich millionaire wanted it back, and so Hansen was forced to create like an authentic-looking model. Now, there's no doubt that the model was on display for a while and was admitted as being a model. You can actually still see the model today. It's on display at the Museum of the Weird in Austin, Texas, which is sort of this cool three-story building where they've got, again, all sorts of weird-looking things on display, like weird animal deformities and all sorts of stuff. So you can go to the Museum of the Weird and see that the sort of fake Minnesota Iceman that turned up a few years after the real one. Now, when the original was supposedly on display, rumors began to circulate that, as I said, that it wasn't just an unknown type of ape shot in either Minnesota or Vietnam, but it was a primitive human. And from there, rumors or stories, if you like, circulated to the effect that, what if it's a primitive human and it's dead and it was deliberately shot? Does that mean, technically, in the eyes of the law, that this was murder? Just because it's not Homo sapien like us, if it's still a primitive human, it's still a primitive human, and so charges could be brought. And this actually, in a roundabout way, got back to the FBI. And a special agent from the nearest office of the FBI to where Frank Hansen was living in Minnesota actually came out to his trailer where he got all his stuff on display and said, I want to take a look at this Minnesota Iceman. And, of course, Frank Hansen was a bit disturbed and worried. It's not every day, the FBI turn up on your doorstep, never mind asking to see this sort of monstrous thing frozen in a large block of ice, which is what it was. And Hansen basically told the story and explained that, no, it wasn't a primitive human, it was an ape. And so the agent, was satisfied by that and essentially said, well, if it's an ape, it's nothing to do with us. You're free to do whatever you want with it. But Hansen, kind of being an astute businessman who put the Iceman on display whenever or wherever, there was a dollar value on it, he created this huge sign which said something like the Minnesota Iceman investigated by the FBI, which probably didn't go down too well with the FBI, but for Hansen's purposes, it only added to the controversy, and for years it was put on display and travelled the US, and people would see it and photograph it in different places, and some people swore the one they saw was the real one, and others said, well, I'm not so sure, but even to this day now, if there was a real one, we don't know where it is, but as I said, the other one's on open display, and you can actually go and see it and get your picture taken with it as well.
Well, and I know that it came through the Southcoast of Massachusetts area years ago, and everybody that saw it, they still call into the show to this day and complain about how fake it was. But that's probably at the point when they were touring the model and not the original.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing because many of the original people who saw it, like Ivan Sanderson, for example, they were sure that what they saw was real, and they actually said that when they got close to the ice, they could sort of smell like rotting meat. Now, to go to that extent, to make it look real to the point where you could actually fool long-standing cryptozoologists and even introduce like a smell of rotting meat, I'm not sure, whether somebody would have gone to all that trouble when they knew that the person couldn't touch it and examine it because it was in a frozen block of ice. So that is kind of in favor of the idea that there were two Minnesota Icemen, the admitted model and potentially the real one that, was sort of whisked away back to whoever this mysterious millionaire was.
And I know that, at least in my opinion, they might have had a little bit of interest in it because they had their own creatures frozen on ice, and they just wanted to make sure that he didn't come up with one of the same things that they had. That's just, and you have some stories in the book too that kind of would back that up because it's very possible that we do have Bigfoot in the possession of the government.
Yeah, I mean this is one of the things where it's always worth keeping in mind, not just what the programs or the projects are or the fact that they exist, but why they exist. And the reason why they exist or why interest is taken may actually, like, you just pointed out, relate to something in the background. It might not just be directly related to, say, the Minnesota Iceman. There could be sort of a backstory that we're not seeing the full picture of that sort of prompted that interest, if you like.
And Bigfoot's something that comes up or different versions of that type of creature, whether you want to say that Yeti and, the Abominable Snowman and all these are part of the same whatever it may be. But that's a creature that seems to come up in a lot of government files across the world.
Yeah, it is. And, I mean, that's intriguing because, if Bigfoot is just an unknown ape and nothing else, why would there even be government interest? I mean, it's not like... if it's just a North American equivalent or a Himalayan equivalent of an African gorilla, a Congo gorilla or a chimpanzee, why the interest? And what I've found, and granted it gets into controversial areas, is that government agencies don't seem to take an interest in every Bigfoot report under the sun, so to speak, but they take more of an interest where there are associations with other phenomena like UFO activity or sightings of strange lights over the woods where Bigfoot's seen in the same place and the same time. There's actually a lot of reports like that, and I include these in the book. So this kind of suggests to me that one of the things that fascinates me is this other aspect of cryptozoology where clearly some of these creatures are unknown animals, but others seem more paranormal based, or they are linked with things like supernatural phenomena or UFOs. And I think the interest taken at an official level may not just be in the creature, but because studying the creature might actually open doors to some of the answers concerning these other phenomena as well, possibly.
And that might be why, the Air Force, for example, was so interested in Bigfoot, because it's not just the creature itself, but the fact that it ties into all these other anomalous factors.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, a friend of mine, Stan Gordon, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, a very good book called Silent Invasion, which deals with Stan's personal investigations of a wave of Bigfoot and UFO activity in Pennsylvania in 72, 73. Back then, Stan was just a young guy, and we had a deep fascination with the paranormal. And fortunately, he was on hand to chronicle all these events, and write about them and interview the people back at the time. And his book paints a huge picture of really weird activity where people in a lot of these isolated little villages and towns, heavily forested again, and rural areas in Pennsylvania, saw these sort of large hulking creatures, approaching their farms and properties, etc., at the same time that strange lights were in the sky. Not necessarily, gleaming flying saucers. Sometimes they were like little weird balls of light that seemed to be under intelligent control. But on a number of occasions, Stan found evidence where military personnel had quietly gone out to interview the witnesses after they'd had their encounters. If their stories are published in the newspapers and, Mr. Smith of whatever road, in this little village, and the person was identifiable, the military went out. Now, these weren't sort of like sinister interviews, where the person was silenced and threatened. It was actually a case where the military opened themselves up and said, look, we'd like your help and assistance, but we'd prefer it if you didn't give it too much publicity. But we want to show you a few photographs of things we've got on file and see if you can compare anything that you saw with what we've got, or what we've got on file in terms of photographs. And a number of witnesses spoke about how they were visited by military personnel who opened briefcases and, black and white and colour, sort of 8x12 pictures would be brought out of these weird creatures, and somebody might say, yeah, that sort of is close to what I saw, but that one's nothing like it. And they were like, well, did you see anything else weird? Did you experience any missing time or have any strange dreams afterwards? Things like this. So it seems clear that the military knew something was going on and were trying to build a pattern and, approaching witnesses even. And even Stan himself was contacted by an arm of government and basically asked, hey, if anything interesting comes up, if you get any hard evidence or really good cases, would you mind just keeping us informed? And Stan was like, well, yeah, sure. But he was baffled again as to why. But again, I think it comes back to when we look into it, Bigfoot isn't just an unknown ape. There are these weirder aspects to it that I think the military, I actually don't believe the military is hiding all the answers and got all the answers. They may not have any answers aside from a lot of data and a lot of questions. But, it's like those of us on the outside, we've got a lot of data and a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers. I think sometimes, there's a tendency to think if governments investigate something, they've got all the answers. They may be as mystified as we are, but they're just looking for those answers, and they've got a bigger budget to do it with.
But the problem with that is that they just can't seem to admit if they don't have the answers. I mean, I think people would feel a lot better about a government investigation into an unknown creature if the government was forthcoming about the fact that, hey, we don't know what this is either. And we'd like to work hand in hand with people like Stan Gordon and Ivan Sanderson and Lauren Coleman and Nick Redfern and try to find these answers. But instead, they try to do everything because secrecy is just the natural way in which they operate, that it actually tends to make things seem more ominous than they may be.
Yeah, and I think, maybe some of the data is ominous. We don't really know what has been collected at an official level beyond what we've got pretty much through the Freedom of Information Act, etc. So maybe there are a few ominous things, or it could just be, the nature of government is to sort of work outside of, the general populace. And of course that does, you're right, sort of provoke questions about, well, why is it going ahead like that? And, maybe sometimes the questions are justified. Maybe other times it's just that's how bureaucracy works, or it could be a combination of the two. I think I'll be the first to admit that when it comes to this issue of cryptozoology and the government or governments, it's still early days, so to speak. It's not like Roswell, where we've been investigating it for 30 years. This is a relatively new angle, not necessarily new angle, but sort of newly investigated angle, if you like, and I hope, over time it'll bring more data forward, but I think it is definitely early days in terms of what we know versus what, may actually be known.
And I think part of the problem, too, might be that with such congressional oversight about the budget for these departments, that maybe they want to make sure that they're keeping this stuff under the rug because they don't want to have to go before Congress and answer questions about how much money they're spending on Bigfoot research when there's other serious budgetary concerns.
Well, yeah, and I actually think that's a good point because, even if the government or governments, again, have proof that Bigfoot is real but they're not sure what it is, but they're intrigued by these weirder angles, it's kind of like the whole one-upmanship thing when one party is in power, they criticize the other party and vice versa. And I can well understand if, the party that's not in power at one time uncovered that the party that is in power has a Bigfoot project, they play that to the hilt, you know what I mean, in terms of, well, there are better things to spend money on, than Bigfoot. So I actually think, sort of mainstream bureaucracy probably plays a part in this as well. It could go from high-level conspiracy to totally bland bureaucracy. And I think it probably hovers somewhere between the two, most of the time.
Well, you mentioned political parties, and at least in terms of this country, do you find any correlations between what parties are in power and an increase in some of these files and these stories coming from the U.S. government?
Not really, no. I mean, again, I think it's important to remember that for the most part, the files are surfacing from military and intelligence agencies through the Freedom of Information Act. And of course, a lot of the people who are in the military, they're career people, they sign up, they they enjoy the lifestyle and being in the military, and they're there for, until they reach retirement age after they've done their mandatory period if they sign on, as a career. And that's the same with the intelligence community, whereas, people in elected government, they may only be in power for 4 years, or at the very most, they're going to be there for 8. And invariably, after they get, if they're out after 4 years, they go on to do something else, sell their memoirs or whatever, to write their autobiography. But the intelligence and the military, that's a very different kettle of fish, so to speak. So, in answer to your question, I don't think which actual government is in power has much of a bearing when it's the military and the intelligence agencies that are the ones, opening these files and collating the material, etc.
Right. Plus, these programs must be so deep and ongoing that it's going to take a lot longer than just for the amount of time that one particular party is in power anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, a lot of these programs, they are ongoing, for years, collecting data and trying to assimilate it and understand it. And, sometimes with the best will in the world, 4 years of one person's presidency isn't going to cut it, in terms of what you need to know and find out. And that applies to any subject, where there's a defense or a military angle to it. It's like with the trying to evaluate how many nuclear missiles the Soviets had at the height of the Cold War. You're not going to get all the answers in, say, Eisenhower's presidency or Kennedy's, or Nixon's. It's going to run across, and it's going to change over the years as, the economy of the Soviet Union changed. And I think that's the same here, that a lot of these programs are very much ongoing.
And we always have, especially if you talk to people like Steve Bassett, like hoping that Obama is going to be the disclosure president when it comes to UFO activity. And it seems like we expect these figures to come in and kind of spearhead letting the public know what's been going on. And as Bill Clinton can tell you, he didn't even get the answers. He asked the questions and he was told, don't ask. So it goes beyond what one political party can do.
Yeah, I mean, I know for the most part disclosure is related to UFOs, but if it ever happened, conceivably, it might touch on Bigfoot, in some of these files. But unfortunately, I do believe there's a genuine UFO phenomenon, and I also do believe there are certain people within the official world who know more than we know. To what extent they have answers or they've got a lot of data, that's a different matter. I don't know. But unfortunately, I do not believe that disclosure is going to happen. And that's not me being pessimistic or, just negative about it. My view is that if there is sort of like a restricted access organization that has access to startling information, well, they wouldn't wait, if they wanted to release it, they wouldn't wait until ufologists go knocking on the door saying, we want this releasing. They would have done it when they wanted to do it. And the fact that disclosure has been going on for years and we've been told it's coming, but it never ever does, that suggests to me that if there are these big secrets, then it doesn't matter how much knocking is done on the door, it's not going to surface until, or even if, the people who are sitting on the material are comfortable about releasing it. And the day may never come when they're comfortable about releasing it. And it doesn't matter if there are 20,000 or 20 million letters being sent in. It's not going to make any difference to that black box of, that black box body that is sitting on the data. And again, I said that's not being pessimistic. That's how governments work, that if it's need to know and there's no need to know, you're not going to know. They don't care about what a few thousand ufologists think or write in their magazines, that, we're putting a new petition together, this time it's going to work. I'm sure they don't even give that a second thought because it's not on their agenda. When it's on their agenda, and if it's on their agenda, that's when it'll be released.
Right, and the same could be said for these monster files too. That if they have all these Bigfoot files that they've been accumulating over the years, well, short of anybody capturing a live Bigfoot and having it in their own possession, they have no reason to come forward with this information. And even then, even if that was to happen, they still might just shake their head and say, "Hey, we didn't know anything about it."
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, I think it's like the only way. I think there's only a couple of ways disclosure could ever happen. If the agencies themselves or whatever the secret project is, if they didn't decide to release it, I think the only way it could happen is by an unforeseen event, like there was a major UFO activity, somewhere in the skies all across the planet which could not be denied. Then I think pressure would be put on to the point where it would be inevitable that, it would all come crumbling down. But what we have to remember with UFOs, and ironically with things like Bigfoot, is these beings, creatures, whatever you want to call them, they're actually, whether wittingly or not with the government, and I think it's not with the government, but they're following the same approach of taking a stealthy, behind the closed doors approach. It's not like we're having UFOs landing on the White House lawn or, coming down to cure cancer. They're behaving in a stealthy, silent, secretive fashion as well. So, in other words, that makes it even more doubly difficult to get the answers. And so unless, as I said, they change their approach, and throughout history they clearly haven't, they've been like a silent partner that works alongside us or does things alongside us, and we seem to be involved, and people talk about these genetic programs, but they clearly don't want to show themselves to us. So unless that changes, that sort of aids the silence factor as well, I think.
Well, and also too, we touched a little bit upon this earlier, that all of these strange creatures that we're talking about, it does have a tactical advantage if we aren't sure what they are. They can use that uncertainty, and they can use that basic fear of the unknown as a weapon, should they so choose to do so. I mean, you write about it in the book about how they kind of used that to some degree in the Philippines in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. This relates to a man named General Edward Lansdale. And Edward Lansdale was a brilliant psychological warfare expert. That's to say, he was the sort of person who could essentially, I won't say win a war, but he could certainly influence key battles and situations without really using troops and manpower and weapons. And he would do that by essentially scaring the enemy, particularly in parts of the world where superstitions were sort of reigned, if you like. And one classic example is a program that he came up with in the early 1950s when the U.S. government was lending assistance to the Philippine government, and they were battling against these rebels known as the Huks, H-U-K. And the Huk rebels were sort of a major hostile force. And so the Philippine government said to the Americans, can you help us out? And America said, yeah, sure, what do you want? Do you want military aid? What do you want? And so it was a combination of things, but General Edward Lansdale went out there and got to know people in the government very well and became actually good friends with a number of the, the Philippine government people. And one of the things he did was to look at the myths and legends that the Huk rebels believed in. And he actually decided to bring one of them to life. And they had a deep belief in and a great fear of a creature known as the Aswang vampire. And this was kind of like a Philippine equivalent of like Count Dracula, like a blood-sucking humanoid monster that would surface at night and prey on the living and drain them of blood for food, essentially. And then you would turn into one of these creatures. And the more Edward Lansdale looked into it, the more he found how much the Huk rebels deeply feared this creature. So he decided to bring it to life, not physically, but what he did, he set up this program where they had like a team of military personnel who were trained to go out into the woods where they knew the Huk rebels were, and to sort of stealthily creep up on a Huk rebel if he was sort of the last man in the patrol, or if he was just walking around patrolling the area on his own, and silently kill him by, they actually had this device created which could puncture the jugular vein of a man and leave 2 puncture wounds on the neck, as if they'd been attacked by a vampire. But it was like a specially created metal device. And so the man would be killed, and then they arranged to string him up by his ankles over a tree and drain the body of blood. And then the next day, when under the cover of darkness still, they would sort of lower the body and then stealthily and quietly dump it as close as they could without getting caught to the nearest Huk camp. Then, of course, the next day, the Huk comrades, would sort of go out and find the body, and they'd see these puncture wounds, and this body just white as a sheet and clearly drained of blood. And the Huks, terrified that clearly from their perspective an Aswang vampire was in the area, they would just flee. They'd flee 20, 30 miles just to leave the area. And, of course, this area would have been a strategic military gain for the Philippine government, who were very appreciative to the U.S. government for coming up with an alternative way of getting the enemy out of the area, but without risking, human lives. And Lansdale stayed quiet about this for years, but decades later, long after his retirement, he actually wrote about this in his autobiography and went on record about how he created this program, to sort of instill the myth of the Aswang vampire as a reality in the Huk minds, and it worked all too well. And but that was just one of a number of very strange but highly successful operations that he sort of commanded.
Well, one of the frequent stories that comes up in the book and throughout the history of these files is not only sea serpents and lake monsters, and I don't mean to kind of lump them together because they really shouldn't be, but it's probably one of the earliest, at least in this country, in the United States, one of the earliest cryptid stories are these sea serpents that they reported seeing even on their way over into the New World. And I always just made the assumption, hearing these stories growing up, that they were probably just encountering whales and other such creatures they'd never seen before. But it seems from your research in the book here that there may be more to the sea serpent theory than I originally thought.
Yeah, I mean, the cover of the book kind of, in a sensationalized fashion, sort of deals with one of these files. I mean, the cover of the book has like an old 19th or 18th century pirate-type galleon being attacked by a giant sea serpent and almost sort of turned on its side. The truth isn't quite that sensational, but that particular cover actually does relate to one of the chapters in the book. One of the most amazing things I found doing the research, and again using the Freedom of Information Act, was the British Admiralty, which essentially is the same as an old equivalent of the US Navy today. The British Admiralty has a sea serpent file that extended for about 50 years, from about 1830 to about 1880. And it was packed with reports from military ships, like battleships, galleons that were out on the Atlantic and the Pacific, sort of sailing the high seas and defending the British Empire as it was back then. And the the file itself is, as I said, filled with all these reports where the captains and crews of these military ships had encountered, very often in the Atlantic Ocean, more so than the Pacific, giant-sized creatures that really you can only describe as sea serpents. They had like a long serpent-type body with flippers and a huge elongated neck and head that would sort of stand 15 or 20 feet out of the water. And what was amazing is in some of these cases, the ship's crew and captain described these creatures as being like 250 feet long. You know, it sounds like something out of some Japanese monster movie, you know, Godzilla versus whoever, you know what I mean? That's how it comes across. But when you recognize the fact that when you read the reports, they're talking about the captain and the crew all sort of just stood on one side of the deck, open-mouthed, watching as these creatures would sort of sail past, you know, like 20 miles an hour, clearly visible and just half out the water, you know, half surfacing. Perhaps the creatures were even wondering what the ships were, you know, were they a rival creature invading on its territory? We don't know. But all these reports from military crews were quietly filed away. And what I found interesting was that whoever in the Admiralty had compiled this report, and it must have been a number of people, the fact that it spanned more than 50 years, but it also contained newspaper clippings from British regional and national newspapers that also talked about sightings of sea serpents by ship's crews, and also like civilian ships out on the ocean, you know, like passenger ships. So somebody was taking a deep interest in these reports. Now, although I can't prove it, what I can say for sure is that there have been rumours that over the years, British Royal Navy ships have not just encountered sea serpents, but may have been attacked by them. And there are one or two stories or rumours of ships actually being sunk by them, and where the Royal Navy kind of covered up the event and claimed, you know, it was due to hitting an iceberg or the ship sprung a leak due to faulty design and sank. And probably, if the stories are true, almost certainly they were done to, you know, prevent fear and hysteria breaking out and people being frightened to sort of, you know, travel the oceans. So I suspect that if even just one of these stories has some truth to it, that would explain why the British military was concerned and why it opened these files, because if one ship had been attacked, another could end up attacked, and another. So I think they wanted to keep a handle and a careful watch on it to see how things developed or didn't develop, you know.
And I think, too, the other thing is the British Royal Navy had such a reputation as being so fearsome and being virtually indestructible that if these stories got out, it might have actually tarnished that reputation a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, back then, you know, the British Empire, you know, Britain ruled half the world at one point. Today, Britain rules Britain, you know, and that's enough for the government to cope with, the British people. You know, we're a funny bunch. And so, but back then, yeah, you're right. I mean, joking aside, there was this empire, you know, it ruled over India and parts of Africa and Australia and Canada, you know. And so anything that sort of might have impinged upon that reputation would have sort of perhaps, you know, sort of stained the image. And so, again, it may not just have been the file was, you know, the information was hidden because of what it related to, but, you know, the knock-on effect, the spiraling effect of how the image could be sort of hurt or affected, if you like.
Well, I'll give you a funny little anecdotal story about the British Navy in the War of 1812 in the town where I live, Wareham, Massachusetts. The Nimrod, which at the time was the most fearsome ship in their navy, pulled up, you know, to our harbor, and they really didn't have anything planned, and they were kind of just, you know, looking to get some supplies and move on. But because they had to keep up appearances and they had to keep up the, you know, the mighty image of the Nimrod, they grabbed a few local residents and took them on board as hostages. And then they just sailed away, and they went about a mile up the coast and just pulled in and dropped them off again. So
oh, that's good.
Keeping up appearances for sure. Now, before we let you go, I do want to ask you about what I thought was one of the weirdest and just one of the strangest stories in the book, and it must have been for you when you first found out about it, and that's the story of Acoustic Kitty.
I knew you were going to say that one. When you started that build-up, then I knew it was going to be that. Yeah, Acoustic Kitty is one of those stranger-than-fiction stories that, you know, you could not invent. It's so weird that you could not make it up. And I'm not making it up. It was basically a CIA program which had the nickname of Acoustic Kitty. And it goes back to the mid-1960s when the CIA came up with a strange and unusual and definitely alternative idea to essentially try and install or insert, is probably a better way of describing it, sort of surveillance technology into cats, living cats. That's to say, like insert radio devices, an antenna into its tail, that kind of thing. So what you would essentially have would be like a walking, meowing, bugging device, which could broadcast or transmit across the airwaves recorded voices, etc., to headquarters. And the plan was to have this sort of entire fleet, or how I don't know, or tribe, whatever you want to call it, of
maybe a litter.
acoustic kitties. Yeah, of acoustic kitties. The idea was to have them released in the vicinity of the Soviet embassy in Washington D.C. and try and train them to sort of jump the fence and wander around the grounds, or with the best stroke of luck, actually go inside the embassy. And the thought was that Soviet embassy staff wouldn't give a second thought to seeing a pleasant little cat wandering around the grounds. They might even feed it and look after it. And the plan was, well, maybe, just maybe, while the cat, while the transmitting equipment's turned on, the cat will pick up snippets of information where a KGB agent is feeding the cat at the same time he's talking to some other KGB guy about a classified program. And so they actually apparently did have success in inserting all this technology into this one particular cat. And I actually got hold of a few files on this officially through the Freedom of Information Act, but they are massively redacted. I mean, just a few snippets here and there. But what we know is that on the very first sort of trial run, that the agents pulled up as close as they could to the embassy without giving the game away or looking suspicious. They opened the back doors of the van and let the cat out, gently put it on the ground and, kind of encourage it to cross the road towards the embassy. And as it did so, it got hit by a taxi on the first run and killed. And so, unfortunately, Acoustic Kitty became Splattered Kitty, if you like. And which is unfortunate for the cat, but it is kind of an amusing story. But it was one of these projects that looked great on paper, but that worked less far well in practice. And so it was basically closed down, with a recommendation that it not be undertaken again, because in the real life scenario, the whole process was just too difficult and fraught with, well, what if, or that, or, and it was just seen as too, it actually cost $10 million, which, as I point out, was $4 million more than the $6 million man was applied to him, when he was made bionic, but this bionic cat, it just did not work, as inevitably it might not have done. But it certainly, full marks, it was an amazingly well thought out project, and, it probably makes you wonder how many other ones went on of a similar nature that, we don't even know about still today.
Well, and it's funny because you said, that it might have worked on paper, but looking at all the different animals they could have used for such an attempt, why'd they have to pick the animal that is like the most independent and the least likely to listen to human beings? I mean, I've had cats for 30 years, and I can't even train them to not go on the couch. No,
I mean, a dog would have been an ideal one. I mean, cats do have that image, it's kind of like if you tell them what to do, they have that look on their face, so they just look at you as if they might as well be giving you the finger, you know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
But that's how a cat basically operates. They're their own boss, and they'll come and, if they want a bit of fussing and attention, they'll come over to you, and if they don't, they won't. So, yeah, I mean, with a dog, it may well have worked, but maybe whoever initiated the project was a dog lover, and they weren't keen on cats, so they didn't mind, working on a few cats, I guess.
That could be. I mean, maybe they figured, too, it's easier to, a stray cat is more likely to be taken in than a stray dog. Stray dogs usually end up at the pound.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we don't actually know where the first cat or, however many that they were going to use, where they would have come from. Would they have had to set up like a breeding farm or something, an Area 56 or something, the hangar containing all these cats or something, we just don't know what the alternate plans would have been.
Would have just imagined, we would have found out about every single mouse and bug crawling around the embassy. Not so much about the KGB agents, but we'd know every little corner of the house where they shouldn't have been.
Yeah, exactly. That was the thing, it was these issues of it being, sort of haphazard in terms of you couldn't predict anything. That's the problem where, in a number of cases where they tried to use animals in weird experiments, it was the unpredictability of being unable to have, a trained soldier involved. That, sometimes a cat would just, see a bird and wander off or whatever,
So, Nick, I know you're always working on something, so can you kind of give us any kind of a sneak peek of what you might be working on next?
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of UFO books. One which sort of relates to the whole issue of where files should exist, but we can't find them. As if they belong in some of these, as they're known as special access programs, SAPs, where, even through the Freedom of Information Act, we can't find them. Like, for example, the files on Roswell. So clearly something significant happened at Roswell, but where are the papers? And there are a number of stories, actually documented cases where whole swathes of paper and files from the old Roswell base from 45 to 49 are actually missing. That's a part of the official record. It's not like they're being withheld; they're just gone. So the book covers things like that. So I'm working on that one, and also a couple more cryptozoology road trip type books of expeditions I've been on in the last year or so, and things like that. Excellent.
What's the best way for people to keep up to date with all of your works?
Well, people can reach me at my blog, which is Nick Redfern 14, FORTEAN.blogspot.com, and they can reach me via my Facebook link there, or just go straight to Facebook and type in Nick Redfern, and you'll find me. And always pleased to chat with people. And the new book, Monster Files, you can get it online at Amazon, or you can buy it off the shelf in Barnes & Noble. It's available sort of online and in the old-fashioned way as well.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Nick, and we look forward to talking to you when the next one comes out.
All right, thanks a lot, Tim. See you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too, bye.